Now, this is really the hardest part of the story of my wife's decline with alcoholism, and the story has to do with when my mother was dying. She had a series of strokes, and we had flown from California to New York. My father had asked me to come out, and obviously I was very close to my mother. And it's really the most difficult part because during the day I would go to the hospital with my son and my siblings and my dad, and we would really we would sit with my mother. We would watch her breaths. She was really on her deathbed, and we knew it, and we knew we were going to have to make a decision about what to do. But my wife didn't come along with us. She stayed back at my dad's house, because part of it was she was still hungover from days before. She had been drinking constantly on the plane, at bars, and she had pretty much emptied uh, the refrigerator. My brother had bought a 12 pack, and from there we thought that was all the alcohol in the house. We weren't really thinking about other things. So what happened was I came home a little early one day. I think it was probably the first week we're there with my son, and we came into just a horror show. And you have to realize this was my dad's house, my parents' house, the house I grew up in. And we came in, we went through the garage, we walked in through the back garage door in the family room, and my wife, we walked in, and my son walked in first, and he goes, "Dad, Mom's on the floor." And I went, "What? What are you talking about?" I walked in, and she was passed out on the floor. I mean, she was covered in urine all over the carpet, and I was just like, how could she have possibly gotten alcohol? My dad doesn't really drink that. I didn't know there's any alcohol in the house. And she couldn't drive anywhere. She'd been home alone all day. And what had happened was my dad had in the kitchen, in an area, he had a bunch of old dusty bottles, like Jack Daniels, vermouth. I mean, bottles that were probably 30, 40, 50 years old, that had been there for years. And I completely forgot about them, like cooking sherry and stuff like that. And she had systematically drank almost every bottle in the place. And some of them might have had this much, some of them were full, some of them were half. I mean, and probably half the bottles were gone. And in the space of the few hours that we were gone, she had sat there and just chugged hard alcohol. And as a result, she was passed out in my dad's family room. And after we got over, the initial shock, I think just the idea of the crossing such a boundary, to even, being able to come to my dad's house. My mother was dying, and the only thing my wife cared about was getting her fix, getting the alcohol. And I realized at this point the disease had permeated and become such a part of her that she was no longer there. It just didn't seem like my wife was even in the house anymore. She was gone. And now I was just dealing with this just out of control, very mentally ill person. And that's really how I had to objectively look at it. So we got her back upstairs, and I looked underneath the bed, and again, there was like half a dozen bottles underneath the bed, probably 10. I took the ones that still had alcohol in them, and I took them and I hid them down in the cellar. It was just atrocious, and she was just a mess. We had to clean up the carpet. I remember my son and I scrambling to clean up the carpet so it didn't look like a giant mess, and didn't smell, and it was just unbelievably embarrassing. And again, none of these stories are really designed to disparage alcoholics or my wife because she was an alcoholic. It's talking about and understanding the awareness that families go through in this situation, and it becomes an impossible situation. So many people have asked me, so why did you take her on the trip? Well, leaving her home would have been far more dangerous. She was in a state where she probably would have drank herself to death. Or worse, she could have burned the house down. She had tended to cook things and forget the burners were on. The animals probably would not have been taken care of. We left her for a week one time, and the animals were left outside. Some of them were never fed. It was just a horrific, impossible situation. Taking her was the lesser of the two evils. And this was a situation where I had to go because my mother was dying. And all I could think about and all I had to deal with was my wife. And I know so many families are going through this or some semblance of a situation like this. And after this incident, I really had a talk with my brother, and he said, "Well, Mom's stabilized right now. You know, if you guys want to go somewhere, you know, for the next week or so, I know you're only going to be here for a couple of weeks. Why don't you, you know, why don't you take off somewhere?" It was kind of his hint, like, Dad doesn't need your frickin' wife around here. And I went, "Yeah, I know, I get it." So we ended up, I rented a car and we ended up going down to Gettysburg, and then we went down to Washington, D.C. And if you followed me, the nightmare continued. In fact, I think the worst was in Washington, D.C., and I'll actually go over that in the next video. She got extremely inebriated and ended up really thrashing the hotel room. And I'll go over that in the next story. But again, these stories are really designed to resonate for families. And also, alcoholics need to recognize the impact that they have on their families, and recovering alcoholics need to understand they don't ever want to go back to this place. And I hope that really makes sense. And again, this story and so many other stories similar to it are all in her memoir. It's called Amanda, A Cautionary Tale of Alcoholism. It was the story of her 25-year decline with alcohol use disorder, and unfortunately, she passed away almost 5 years ago this February. The thing is, she was a very kind, loving, empathetic person. The alcohol took all of that away, and that's the saddest part of all. You know, again, I go live Monday through Friday right around 6 o'clock Pacific Standard Time, 9 o'clock Eastern Time. We also have the Facebook group. It's called There's an Alcoholic in the Family. Link is in the bio. And when you're ready to work with me one-on-one, I have a complete coaching program that's designed for the alcoholic and the family. Set up a call. Set up a breakthrough call. It takes about 45 minutes to an hour. The call is free. The course is definitely not. But I'm looking for people who want to change their lives and the lives of their family. And again, thanks so much for listening.